Okay, friends, well, thank you. We're going to move on to our second session, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, who's coming down with some water here just on the right. So Mary Elizabeth Moore is Dean Emerita and Professor Emerita of Theology and Education at Boston University School of Theology. She studies the relationship of lived religion and tikkun olam, or the repairing of the world, with focus on ecological and social justice issues, issues of theological and existential importance, issues that obstruct or enhance justice. So her activism and research addresses cultural and racial diversity, ecological justice, interreligious relationships, liberative theologies, education, leadership making, white privilege, gender, and sexuality, and a whole host of issues. In addition to several books, she also writes poetry exploring the depths of these different realities. She played a formative role in the early founding and the development of the Center for Process Studies, and as such is uniquely positioned, I think, to moderate this second session on religious experience and religious belonging. So please welcome with me Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore.
Thank you, Andrew, for proceeding while I ran for my water. Welcome. We have three very interesting papers today, so I look forward to a great session. The first paper is from Tim Burnette, and he is a minister of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and is the Curator of the Way Collective in Santa Barbara, California, which is a contemplative community for love and liberation. He earned his DMin in Spiritual Renewal, Contemplative Practice, and Strategic Leadership from Claremont School of Theology. And he is passionate about bringing sustaining spiritual practices to the work of justice. He is inspired to live and to live out the call described by Dorothee Soelle when she says, to erase the boundary between the mystical internal and the political external. He is a father of 3 beautiful children. We're going to have to take his word for that. And partner to his wife, Cara, and a writer, teacher, and process philosophy nerd. Welcome, welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. It's wonderful to be here, and we're going to launch into this. So, let's find a good spot for this. That's not going to work. Nearing the end of the 20th century, German liberation theologian Dorothee Soelle recognized that there had been very little examination on the relationship between mystical experience and societal and political behavior, noting that much of what gets broadly categorized under the umbrella of something like perennial philosophy seeks to analyze the soul and God alone without any social analysis. And thus, in writing her penultimate work, The Silent Cry, Mysticism and Resistance, she undertook the project of erasing the distinction between a mystical internal and a political external, reflecting on the truth that there is no experience of God that can be so privatized that it becomes and remains the property of one owner, the privilege of a person of leisure, the esoteric domain of the initiated. Inherent in this claim is a significant critique of the rampant liberal desire for independence, namely that there's a direct connection between the tendency to privatize and commodify the mystical dimension of one's spiritual experience and the over-individualized aesthetic of modern life that works as a force for division and separation in our world. Soelle was a prophetic voice who, more than 4 decades ago, decried an emergence of American fundamentalism that she called Christo-fascism, which she saw as a soft fascism whose characteristics of chauvinism, nationalism, international militarization, racism, violence, and anti-communist sentiment were not enforced, but rather freely bought by the public. In this observation, she offers us a rich history from which to create new resonances and responses from a contemporary process perspective that are just as relevant in resistance to a post-January 6th riot world as they were in last century's seminal Christo-fascisms. Contemplative process bodyings of non-duality in their metaphysical and communal applications have the potential to act as forms of mystical resistance in line with Zola's solicitation to erase the distinction and oppose the bifurcating tendencies of our society's late capitalist, neoliberal ideals and their corresponding theocratic movements. In essence, we must ask what relations exist between the mystical and the political, and furthermore, how something like the affect of the mystical yield of non-duality can relate to the societal temptation toward privatization. Thus, as Zola has created an opening for further reflection, specifically that we need both the inner light of being one with every living thing and the resistance against the machine of death. Both mysticism and resistance must be commingled together in a critical harmony of a processual non-duality with a communal embodied metaphysic. With an acknowledgement of a metaphysical process phenomenology of value-laden becomingness, and a call to the resistance of societal forces of bifurcation through creative, collective problem-solving with an urgent call to love, we have the potential not to send ourselves off into some non-dual ether, but to ground our becoming lives in a convivial, organic, and embodied praxis of liberation. Before we progress, it might be helpful to inquire of contemplative author and teacher Cynthia Bourgeau's clarifying of the nature of non-duality. In her book, The Heart of Centering Prayer, she opens the question of non-duality in this way. There's a general vague agreement that non-dual has something to do with no separation. But what does this mean exactly? Does it equate to a mystical experience, like make me one with everything? A philosophical monism, it's all one? A transcendence of polarity or an elimination of polarity? Can you still think in a non-dual way, or is that an oxymoron? Is it the same thing as permanent enlightenment? Is it the falling away of the self? Recognizing the inherent multifarity of non-duality, Bourgeau then offers a helpful summary from which to view a kind of practical non-duality, particularly in recognizing that the embodiment of non-duality is primarily a perceptive shift. She writes, rather than perception through differentiation, the programming used by the cognitive mind, one begins to perceive through holographic resonance, the capacity to sense the whole pattern as a single unified field. Of course, one then sees from wholeness, i.e., non-separation. So in Bourgeau's definition, to be a non-dual practitioner is essentially to enflesh an increasing capacity to see from unifications, from the multifarity of one's vast types of experiences, utilizing their interconnection as a kind of perceptual vantage point. This notion is very similar to what Kathleen Reeves has called process awareing, which is a shift in the hippocampus's focus away from future mapping based on past data to a beautiful mandala of prehensions to be cherished. This deepening sense of non-duality is one in which one becomes more aware by learning to see from a unified field as a collating of effect of mystical experience. At its heart, Bourgeau invites those who seek to deepen their non-dual awareness to become what she refers to as living icons of one of the most archetypal and noble of human activities, communion with the infinite. This communion must be something beyond a sole emphasis on either Western I-thou or Eastern I conceptions of mystical experience, precisely because a process conception of non-duality is a dynamic one, including both emphases in what Roland Faber calls a world-oriented divine all-one that expresses itself as a self who is essential relationality. And this apophatic inversion is the embodiment of a God that has no intention of being something for itself without at the same time being such for others as well. This God has no intention of being some dark mystery behind all differences, but is always already living as self-transcendent creative love, as a divine creative indifference that insists on life. Thus, contemplative process bodyings of non-duality show themselves to be a communion with the infinite that is always already a mystical enfleshing, an embodiment of a non-dual insistence of a divine manifold who calls us to live more fully from the most natural of perceptive modes, seeing from the all-one. In a catalytic sense, the question of erasing the distinction between the mystical internal and a political external by seeking some non-duality is a metaphysical question, beginning by noticing how reality convenes its infinite bodyings and organizes its societies, how the nest of reality gives birth through an interconnected web to more intense forms of experience and life. We can come to see how non-duality is hidden in plain sight as the very nature of a collective becoming that frees us from our individualistic addictions. Coming to know the freedom of being an entirely living nexus that is soaked through to the marrow with an adventurous novelty that is somehow indicative of the whole, can lead us down a mystical path toward coming to brush against the very source of this phenomenon of our innate and relational beauty, and into a dynamic posture that becomes a conduit for divine love to flow more freely through us. In summarizing what many consider to be his pinnacle work on the spiritual life, New Seeds of Contemplation, mystic Thomas Merton closes the final chapter by developing out a theopoetic phenomenology that he refers to as the cosmic dance. In it, he encourages those inquiring of the mystic's path that they should let go of their obsession with what they think is the meaning of it all, and acknowledging that the more we persist in misunderstanding the phenomena of life, the more we analyze them out into strange finalities and complex purposes of our own, the more we involve ourselves in sadness, absurdity, and despair. And yet the fact remains that we're invited to forget ourselves on purpose, cast our awful solemnity to the winds, and join the general dance. That is not to say that one should throw analysis away, as Merton himself was a robust interdisciplinary scholar, but rather it's to say that this contemplative claim resonates with the same essence of a process contemplative wisdom that knows not to seek finalities or misplace concretenesses. The point here is that Merton, similar to Meister Eckhart, invites one to live without why and awaken to beauty instead. For Merton, there's a quickening that happens in instances of realization that could be read as the consolidation of Bourgeois' non-dual awareness, which shows itself as a naked emptiness that is the purity of the novel value of a thing that is itself the very evidence of this cosmic dance. Similarly, in Adventures of Ideas, Alfred North Whitehead has illustrated the relationships between phenomenal beauty, transcending the self, and the consolidation of non-dual awareness, as he invites a move beyond the soul's egoic preoccupation with itself and seeking a peace that carries with it a surpassing of personality. One might notice here that both Merton's invitation to forget ourselves on purpose and Whitehead's invitation to surpass personality are consonant, and that both Merton and Whitehead seem to lapse into a poetics of beauty to describe the effect of this inner shift. Whitehead notes that what emerges in this type of mystical posture where the self has been lost is primarily a trust in the efficacy of beauty, which is itself another value-laden self-justification that introduces a kind of faith that transcends reasonable inquiry in its experiential irrationality. For Whitehead, this widening comes as a gift, as an experience of a positive broadening of feeling due to some deep metaphysical insight, namely a direct connection with an infinitude beyond boundaries of self and non-self, or even of individuality and communality. Thus, perhaps Bourgeois' invitation to a non-dual communion with the infinite invites a process-relational broadening into a mystagogy of becomingness, where one can attune to the realization that reality is a flow of value, and that we are always situated within a mandala of available prehensions of beauty. And furthermore, that the nakedness of instantiating this communion within as this beauty is an invitation to a mystical embodiment of a living phenomenology that resists hegemonic forces that not only seek to commodify experiences, but also those forces which privatize internality as a contrast to the beauty that each of us in our personhood are, which is nothing but an intimation and instantiation of relationality. In reflecting on this mystical awareness, Faber comments in a similar phrasing to both Merton and Whitehead that this experience has an immediacy beyond thought, and that the experience of mystical embodiment is non-different from reality itself. It's a realization of the one consciousness, indeed of the all-one of a divine manifold, which is the result of the insight of recognizing one's own embodying of a fundamental mutual immanence. While recognizing that even the most attuned mystical human beings must also live in both the worlds of duality and non-duality at the same time. Faber's insight calls us to embody the metaphysic here as it relates to Zoella's challenge to seek to move beyond the boundary of interiority and exteriority altogether, in holding them together as a sort of Whiteheadian transunification. One practical invitation to non-duality here is thus to learn to not cling to anything, even one's own existence, as an attempt to slow, sully, or substantialize one's becomingness, but rather to live out of an expressive spontaneity, which is, as Reeves has put simply and elegantly, just life. Just living a life in response to this deep metaphysical insight of one's relationality and processuality. So in some sense, to embody non-duality is to reject individualism by acknowledging that the community of all beings belongs to a common receptacle, and that we have a general metaphysical obligation to both the mutual immanence and the divinity which sustains us. The mystical invitation to a process-relational phenomenology of beauty and its deepening of non-dual awareness provides the fertile ground for the sort of rewilding that we need to embody a resistance to the fascistic and hegemonic forces that seek to privatize and divide us. This posture of non-duality can lead us into politicizations that enact liberation for all, countering not only hegemonic forces that seek to privatize the individual, but also social hegemonic forces, scientistic, imperialistic, theocratic, or otherwise. When we come into contact with our own wildness, we recognize that mystical awareness is communal awareness. In short, our mysticisms must become politicized. Or said another way, our internal experiences of divine love must be carried back into the world, for they are themselves already products of our interrelatedness. It's not enough to simply reject the dynamics of fascism ideologically, but we must create spaces for the collective outworking of a love focused on the common good. In Matthew Siegel's recent essay, wherein he provides a processual intervention into Carl Schmitt's political theology, he notes that Whitehead rejects modern anthropocentric individualism, totalitarian collectivism, and technoscientific materialism in favor of a cosmopolitical vision of each of us as individuals in community. It is to this collective cosmopolitical vision that we now turn to encourage a contemplative political theology for our time. Catherine Keller, in her recent work, A Political Theology of the Earth, draws rhizomatic connections between both contemplation and action. She connects political theology with the kind of aforementioned contemplative process awareing by recognizing how a political theology should slow time into contemplation, if it is one that is both earth and bodies conscious, by recognizing how this current moment is pulled back by lament, tugged ahead by hope, and widened in the pangs of its contractions. This political theology that is already always negative theology is what she calls a secularization that is a kind of apophasis, or an unsaying. This turning contemplative awareness toward secularization is a turning toward concern and action on behalf of the community of all beings. Siegel, similarly to both Faber and Keller here, also notes that Whitehead's own secularizing of the concept of God's function in the world is a much-needed contrast to the Schmittian approach to secularization. He observes that Whitehead's schema of secularization reads the history of Christian empire as a great betrayal of the teachings of Jesus. Whitehead's cosmology is a panentheistic protest against the image of God as totalitarian dictator. Thus, Keller's apophatic opening of a kairotic possibility of radical hospitality beyond humanity's othering impulses, and Siegel's use of Whitehead's secularization of the concept of God as an invitation to an anti-imperial political praxis open up a response to the apocalyptic urgencies of our time. They call for non-duality to be turned inside out in order to enflesh a contemplative political theology for the common good. A clear connection between the metaphysical phenomena of beauty and political analysis and action requires a theological nexus. Siegel recognizes this divine thread as running through both speculative cosmology and political theory in reconceptualizing a divine ground for morality that fraternizes not with projections of totalitarian dictatorial power, but with the sort of political organization that corresponds with a processual, incarnational, panentheistic conception of God as a creature of creativity like the rest of us, namely as an expression of love rather than force. And furthermore, Keller gives her own planetary political theology a body, calling for an enfleshing of the love mandate of the Second Testament. Thus, if the practitioner of a non-dual process phenomenology of becomingness is to move effectively from experience to community, one must recognize, as Siegel has pointed out, that the self-consciousness of our own freedom is revealed also the parousia of an all-loving God. Great. Oh, thank you. The freedom provided by this non-dual awareness of one's becomingness and belovedness is not only an awareness of one's social embeddedness, but also a call to compassionate connection with one's society. A contemplative openness to novelty and non-attachment can be easily become caricatured by both sides of the theopolitical spectrum due to dualistic forms of side-taking, with the claim that God sides only with those who align with orthodox theocratic beliefs by Christofascists on the one hand, and with the notion that God sides solely with the oppressed by liberationists on the other. And yet both lines of thought end in more unhelpful bifurcations. From a process perspective, it's easy to decry Christofascistic hegemonies as perversions of the oneness in our manyness by arguing for a theologized processual liberalism whose outworking is a praxis of radical love together. And yet, in contrast to many of the predominant liberationist traditions, process theists must also move beyond even the popular claim that God takes sides. Womanist process theologian Monica Coleman has responded to this problem by providing a liberationist vision of God who is both fully committed to resisting injustice and also a God who is the all-one. This doesn't mean that God is in support of both the aims of the oppressed and the oppressor, lest it be misunderstood as the condoning of violence in myriad forms. Rather, it means that the God of all is the all-one whose very character is to resist oppression and injustice in each and every event, and that the well-being that God desires for all applies to both oppressed and oppressor, toward the oppressed for their liberation and toward the oppressor for theirs as well. Thus, the outworking of a non-dual political theology must move beyond an indifference where the oppressed are left alone or the oppressors are composted in the process, and toward a more dynamic processual non-duality that requires that we see the value of all creatures in their beauty, while recognizing that violence is an affront to the moral fabric of our society. Only then can we enact societal coordinations that contain the widest possibilities for a more beautiful and liberated life together. Contemplative process bodyings of non-duality require collective creative problem solving if mysticism and political theology are to interweave in meaningful ways. Our solutions to the hegemonic economic, systemic, and planetary oppressions we face can exclude no one, not oppressed nor oppressor, not human nor non-human. The solutions we seek must be an outgrowth of a non-duality that sees from the all-one and includes all beings, enacting a rhizomatic root ball of life support that promotes nonviolence and sustainability. As Keller has noted that though our apocalyptic condition places us in a situation where we may likely never arrive at some final solution, The goal in the pursuit of justice is to fail better by enacting imaginative, secular religious entanglements at the edgy limits of our coalitions. We must not accept the privatizations and bifurcations of our time, and we must heed the call to form contemplative communities whose invitations to mystical living require a non-duality that makes its home precisely in the world of dualisms, where infinity meets the finite in a commitment to love in the very spirit of the very love that gives itself away as the phenomenal beauty of our collective existence. Rather than independence, we must come together to seek interdependence. Rather than divisiveness, we must find inroads that lead to a unity based on our shared metaphysical reality. Communities of faith and conscience must set up rubrics of love that help us transcend theocratic capitulations to the forces that separate us, not only for the sake of contemplative practice or dialogue, but so that the flow of the contemplative stream of experience may give way to a river of justice. In our time, non-duality calls us to resist all forms of societal bifurcation, to resist all hegemonies, fascisms, and death economies. As we meet the challenges of our neoliberal era with a transformative process liberalism and world loyalty that can hold together both the mystical and the political in a praxis that moves on behalf of the all-one. If non-duality is to become any form of resistance at all, it must become the kind that works to unhinge both the internal and external oppressive forces that choke our entangled life together, so that more conduits of divine love can flow freely for the liberation of societies, of societies, of societies. Thank you.